recently did a video of questions for apologists, so why don't you go check it out? But as there's such a popular body of apologetics revolving around the supposed reliability of the Bible itself, I thought it would be worth devoting an entire string of questions to that specific topic. So here goes. Now, before getting to the official list, there's one overarching question that's worth planting in the mind of a Christian whenever these points come up. And that is there any other area of your life in which this kind of argument or historical fact would convince you of the miraculous? In other words, imagine you're just going about your life with no pre-existing religious belief that you hope to justify, and out of the blue you hear a brand new claim about a guy who was God incarnate and did miracles and raised himself from the dead. What would it take to make you give this idea as much as a second thought, much less believe it to the point that it changes how you live your life? Would these apologetics be enough to do it for you? Keep this in mind as we go through these 6 questions about biblical apologetics. Number 1. What does the number of New Testament manuscripts have to do with stories about Jesus being true? So I guess we might as well start by getting this piece of low-hanging fruit out of the way. It's one of the most well-known apologetics for the Bible, at least among wide Christian audiences, and I'm willing to guess that most evangelicals have heard their pastor say that there are more manuscripts of the New Testament than of any other document, and thus that there's more historical evidence for Jesus than anybody else in history, often making comparisons to the smaller number of manuscripts of the Iliad or of documents referring to Caesar. There are a lot of reasons why manuscript count is totally irrelevant, and I dealt with this more extensively in my video titled A Fistful of Manuscripts, so you can watch that if you want. But in short, most of the New Testament manuscripts were produced by the medieval church in factory-like scriptoriums that were the ancient equivalent of the printing press, almost all of them more than 1,000 years after the time of Christ, by the way, and the church had a habit of meticulously preserving any tiny scrap of scripture while being comparatively careless with or even actively destroying other texts. So basically, surprise, the religion that held a theocratic control over the West ended up manufacturing the most copies of its religious documents. So maybe this indicates the historicity of Jesus, or, hear me out, maybe it has more to do with institutional church power? But you shouldn't have to look into history at all to recognize that this argument is absurd. Sure, numerous different contemporary sources referring to an event might give us reason to believe it's likely, but a lot of the same thing copied over and over only proves that someone had the means and desire to copy it over and over. I mean, what would it prove if I photocopied General Zod raised himself from the dead and ascended to heaven over and over? Nothing, right? Well, what if I hired people to make copies by hand? Would that help? No, because a lot of copies of a document saying something happened has nothing to do with anything, and it makes no difference whether those copies are printed or written by hand. In short, this apologetic is trying to conflate 2 ideas in the mind of congregants. 1, a lot of different varied sources that corroborate the same story, and 2, a lot of copies of the same or similar documents from within the same religious movement. One has nothing to do with the other, and any attempt to insinuate that the number of manuscripts indicates an event happened is either intentionally deceptive or flatly ignorant. Number 2. What happened during the 20 years between Jesus' reported death and the writings of Paul? Of course, the number of manuscripts is not the only thing apologists point to as evidence for Jesus. There's also the age of the earliest stories about his resurrection. Roughly speaking, the writings of Paul are estimated to have arisen 20 years after Christ, with the currently accepted Gospels appearing at various dates roughly 40 to 80 years after. Now, these sound like incredibly short periods of time in the big picture of history, and it's easy for apologists to give their audiences the impression that New Testament documents appeared more or less immediately after the life of Christ, indicating that they're accurate accounts of his life, death, and resurrection. But this is very misleading, and to see why, it helps to stop and think about the reality of what it means for 20 years to pass between a proposed event and the first writings about it. For a sense of perspective, imagine that someone just last week wrote about a man who did miracles and was killed, raised from the dead, and ascended to heaven in 1980. The only earlier references to this man was a series of letters written in the year 2000. But these letters refer to him rather vaguely and don't tell the story of his life in any detail, and there are no known records of him prior to the year 2000. Sure, the year 2000 letters might mention witnesses or allude to older recitations that might have dated back to the early 80s, but they do not refer you to any kind of paper trail that you can verify yourself. So as far as we know, these documents are the first writings about this person's life. Thus you might ask a Christian, what would you think of these writings? Would the fact that they arose only 20 to 40 years after the claimed events be impressive to you? Or would you have a lot of questions about the totally silent 20 years that passed before the first documents arose? Would you not wonder what kinds of evolving rumors and oral traditions may have been circulated up to that point? And how stories about him might have changed over time before finally crystallizing into a written document? So while the 20 years between Jesus' reporting life and the writings of Paul sounds small when looked at from across history, it's still a veritable eternity for rumors and legends to develop, especially during that time of widespread illiteracy when people had no access to regular media and stories were mostly spread by word of mouth. Now, we do need to be clear about something when talking to Christians. A lot could have happened during those 20 years. Maybe they contain a string of documents that have been lost to history. Maybe eyewitnesses survived and advised people who wrote the first reports. So we can't prove that the stories in these documents are false. But the question at hand is not whether we can disprove these stories. It's whether they provide solid evidence to us as modern audiences, and sometimes you have to steer Christians back to that point. Now yes, Christians can choose to believe based on the possibility of what might have happened during that time. But when they do that, are they following the evidence? Or just looking for ways to reassure themselves of what they started believing without evidence? Number 3. What do non-Christian authors like Josephus and Tacitus say about the life of Jesus? When do they say it, and where do they say they actually got the information? When I was in Campus Crusade in college, practically every speaker who addressed apologetics would talk about how the existence of Jesus was confirmed by extra-biblical historians. They would often describe in vague but sweeping terms how methodical, trustworthy, and mainstream these historians were, implying that the fact that they made reference to Jesus, despite not even being Christian, was a slam dunk for his historicity. I mean, not only are there lots of copies of New Testament manuscripts, but even the top historians were talking about him, right? But you know what was barely brought up at all? What these authors actually wrote and the circumstances under which they wrote it. Yet we were all too happy to hear vague statements that historians were talking about Jesus, possibly seeing an uncontextualized quote flash across a screen, and walk away feeling confident that what we believed was true. But the devil's in the details here, and apologists like to gloss over the details because once you look at them, you realize there's practically nothing there. I covered this in an earlier video, which I'll link in the description, but basically, the earliest of these historical references came 60 to 70 years after Jesus' reported death. They document nothing substantial about him, instead just making sweeping statements or vague allusions to him and his followers. Even worse, they don't give any indication of where they got the information they're reporting. It would be like someone today making a one-paragraph mention of something happening in the 1940s or 50s without providing documentation or citing witnesses. This is even before addressing the fact that the most famous Josephus reference, at least, is almost certainly a forgery. So I would suggest asking a Christian probing questions about these references, including what they say and why. It should pretty quickly reveal that this appeal to extra-biblical corroboration of Jesus is mostly a bluff. In short, these writings just reveal that ancient historians were aware of the Christian movement, which, of course they were. Number 4. What does it prove if the Bible mentions real people and places from history? I doubt this question is new to most of you, but it's worth keeping at the front of your mind when you talk to apologists. You'll often hear them argue that the Bible is historically accurate, that it has been confirmed by archaeology, that it's corroborated by other sources, and so on. And at times these claims might throw you off, especially when it sounds like an apologist is starting to make a good case for them. But it's always worth taking a step back and asking, what is the apologist making a good case for? Because at least in many cases, if not always, he or she is making the case that the Bible records stories about people and places that actually existed. And as most of you know, this is meaningless. Because of course it tells of real people and places. Because like every other society that constructed myths and legends, the Bible writers lived in the real world and thus mentioned real people and places in their stories. I mean, once you think about it, it would be super weird if they didn't. Seriously. Try making up a story about something happening in our day and age without mentioning any real names and places. You could do it, but you'd almost have to go out of your way to try. So just as the existence of New York City doesn't prove Spider-Man, or the existence of Greek cities don't prove the Iliad, or the existence of the New Mexico desert doesn't prove aliens visited Area 51, the existence of historical details in the Bible proves nothing about the supernatural claims in the Bible. This fact is so mundane, and most of these analogies so familiar, that reiterating it to a bunch of atheists can seem silly. But depending on how the conversation goes, this could be a worthwhile question to ask a Christian even if they don't make the specific argument. because doing so might get them to think about what in the Bible they have good reason to believe. Does it get broad strokes of history right? Sure, fine. But does that give you any good reason to be confident that its stories about miracles are true? And if it does, are you this trusting of every document from every mythological tradition across every society as long as they get a few names or places right? If so, you have no filter for sifting plausible and implausible stories. If not, there's a good chance you're making an exception for the Bible because you're already a Christian. Number 5. What do you think when you find supernatural tales in ancient texts other than the Bible? Many apologists accuse skeptics of approaching the Bible with an anti-supernatural bias. The idea is that there are two views of the world, one being atheistic or naturalistic and the other being theistic or supernatural. So when skeptics reject biblical accounts because they have miracles or gods or whatever, they're essentially creating a circular argument. Roughly speaking, I don't believe the supernatural, the Bible's accounts include the supernatural, therefore the Bible can't be true, therefore there's no evidence for the supernatural. This makes it sound like theists can't win because atheists ignore evidence that doesn't fit their preconception that God doesn't exist. Of course, there's a fundamental flaw with this entire criticism, which is that it places naturalistic and supernatural worldviews on equal footing. And this is nonsense. Very simply put, we see events we'd label natural happening around us all the time, while we rarely, arguably never, see supernatural events. And any such observations are fleeting, difficult to verify, and often hard to distinguish from tricks of perception. In fact, any phenomena we call supernatural would be incorporated into our idea of the natural if we actually had evidence for them and could reliably observe them. So it's not much of a stretch to say that the supernatural is far-fetched phenomena that lacks evidence by definition. While the average person probably doesn't flesh this all out explicitly, most of us have a pretty good intuitive sense of why supernatural elements make a tale less believable. In fact, I dare say practically everybody, Christian or not, judges ancient accounts based on how well they fit our understanding of the natural. For example, most people find it reasonably likely that the character Gilgamesh who appears on the Sumerian king list ruled Uruk sometime during Sumeria's early dynastic period. However, I bet they'd seriously doubt that he ruled for 126 years, and most would immediately reject stories about him befriending a beast man, killing the bull of heaven, encountering scorpion people, traveling the path of the sun beneath the earth, surviving a flood by building a wooden cube, and gaining a flower that grants eternal life. Or at the very least, they'd see how these parts of the story stick out as different from, and more questionable than, more mundane claims about him. So I would ask Christians, what do you think when you hear claims like this about Gilgamesh, or a possibly historical Agamemnon or King Arthur? Do you not distinguish mythological-sounding stories from natural-sounding ones, considering the former more likely embellished or made up than the latter? If you don't, well, you might just be the most credulous person in the world, and I'm slightly concerned for you. But if you do, does this mean you have an anti-supernatural bias? The fact is, doubting stories of the supernatural is not all that weird. It's one of the most basic ways of sorting likely claims from unlikely ones. And even if you for some reason think the Bible is the one true book of supernatural stories, you have to at least understand where people who doubt it are coming from. Number 6. What do you think people should take from the scriptures as historical documents? Of course, supernatural stories are not the only thing we doubt in history. In fact, we're at least somewhat doubtful, or at least tentative, about anything we read in the historical record. And historians rarely claim to know exactly what happened in the past. For example, yes, we disbelieve that Gilgamesh ruled for over a century and was an overpowered demigod. But taking it even further, we're not even certain about the date of his reign, with most historians placing it within a 3,000-year range. And if the Epic of Gilgamesh, or any other document, recorded him having specific conversations and doing specific things on specific days, we wouldn't take that level of detail at face value. I mean, we'd have no way to know they weren't perfectly accurate detailed accounts written by an eyewitness, but we'd have no reason to be confident that they were. So we'd add them to our ongoing pile of evidence in an attempt to bring some tentative focus to our fuzzy picture of Gilgamesh. And if a set of authors portrayed him as either implausibly cruel or virtuous, or if, for example, they depicted him constantly winning battles against amazing odds while showing exceptional courage, we might strongly suspect that their records were colored by some bias or agenda, especially if the authors all knew each other. And when it comes to it, documents will often help us understand how different segments of society viewed a person as much as anything. Historians are rarely, if ever, so confident in the veracity of a historical document that they take it at face value. And they don't, or shouldn't, claim to know the details of what happened at any point in history. Thus, given our healthy uncertainty about the past, as well as the limitations of what we expect any historical document to tell us, I would ask Christians, what do you expect people to do with the Gospels? Do you expect us to conclude that we know Jesus spoke certain precise words? That he performed very specific deeds at specific times, including supernatural miracles? Should we be expected to think that New Testament texts conveyed his temperament so accurately that we should know exactly what kind of person he was? That we can be confident they aren't tainted with significant bias, despite the fact that they were all written by members of the same religious sect and portray Jesus in glowing terms? And so confident that we should arrange our lives around what the documents say Jesus said? If so, why? Because historians never make these kinds of conclusions on any other topic because, frankly, there's no sound historical way to reach them. So even allowing that the number of New Testament manuscripts or references by Josephus or whatever gives a sound historical basis for Jesus, the demands of fundamentalist Christianity far overreach any kind of reasonable historical conclusions about him, which makes it all about just taking it on faith anyway, which is fine if that's what Christians want to do, so why don't they just skip the apologetics and admit it? This program was made possible by a grant from S.R. Foxley, Bob Generic, Nim Morris, Connor Emsley, and Q, and by the generous support of viewers like you. If you'd like to join them in pledging to this channel, please find a link to the Prophet of Zod Patreon below.